Hello. I'm really honoured to be chairing and introducing this book, which is it's a terrific work of journalism to have got this lot not only down on paper but also through the lawyers. I mean, dodging and weaving, what can be said, what has to be cut out. And I really take all my hats off to them for having done it. For me, it's a particular delight and honour to be introducing them, because I feel as if I've been the dark side of their moon, in that I've been doing a parallel and opposite job over the last 16 years. Since the fall of communism, I, a Londoner, went out to the provincial countryside to chronicle the effects of the change, the fall of communism, on the lives of ordinary people. And so we've been doing sort of perfectly complementary jobs, and it's good that we've got together. The process that they describe it as having really taken off with the coming to power of Putin in April 2000, when the sort of the political uncertainties and the uneasiness that the oligarchs were feeling at his assumption of power were the prelude to, I mean, opened the door to this exodus. And what I was charting was people who, while Abramovich was collecting 15 houses here and in other places, the people that I was chronicling were making sure that they had less and less possessions, because somehow they felt that only by not possessing anything could they possibly survive in this very sort of unclean Russia. So that's another sort of opposite and complementary. Just before I let you loose on them, I'd like to quote one thing which is really in common between what they were charting and what I was finding, which is a wonderful little tale which they tell of a young Russian woman learning English in London in the mid-90s. And she was in this international class with lots of Russians and lots of other people in it. And they were given a test. They had to apply, they were given these sort of three circles notionally, one of the past, one of the present, and one of the future. And they had to try and connect them up in relation to their own characters and circumstances. And this young woman says, the Russians in the class were the only ones who didn't connect all the circles. The past and present overlapped, but the future circle always stayed apart. It's shocking, but so true. We have nothing to do with the future. We don't refer to it, don't plan for it, don't think about it. Now that's exactly what I was finding. And again and again, I mean, right at the end of my journey in 2008, one of my key characters, imparting from me, when we were talking about the future, she said, we can't afford to look ahead, any of us. All we can do is live in a continual present, manage each day as it comes. And I think that that's one of the sort of undercurrents of something which will be opening up in this evening's conversation. I'd first just like to ask one or other of you, it doesn't matter which, what it was about London and when that opened the door to it being here rather than New York, rather than Paris or Munich or Berlin, that became their playground.
Do you want to take that, Stuart?
Yeah, I'll pick that up. I mean, I suppose the interesting thing about the history of Russian wealthy migration to London was that it started sort of in the early 1990s when people were making money out of perestroika and so on, and people were coming to London and spending it, and London was seen as the way. You know, you couldn't spend money in Moscow because there simply weren't the goods and the rest of it. They came to London. Some people bought houses. Some people just came on spending sprees. But the big money, I mean, some of the, the future oligarchs did start, putting down roots in London in the 1990s. Berezovsky bought a house in the mid-1990s, and Abramovich, started having a foot in London because he wanted his third child to be born in London in the 1990s. But by and large, it was the middle range who bought in the 1990s. The trigger for what was to follow really came with the election of Putin in 2000. What had happened was that the oligarchs, this sort of super rich elite that surrounded Yeltsin and had made a huge amount of money out of the 1990s, backed Putin for president. And then what happened was that Putin had rather different ideas, and when Putin came to power, he decided to take on the oligarchs. There was a very famous meeting when he summoned all the oligarchs, 2 months after he'd assumed power, to the Kremlin, and basically read them the Riot Act and said, look, the days of the oligarch power are over. You've got to pay your taxes. You can't keep taking money out of the country. And frankly, you've lost it. This is a big shock to the oligarchs because they thought Putin was going to pay them back for the fact that they put him into power. And I think that's the date from which you can sort of measure the birth of Londongrad. They didn't all start moving straight away, but pretty quickly, Berezovsky went into exile shortly after that. Kaczynski went into exile, sort of that, and then gradually there was this sort of acceleration of the Russian super rich into London. So I think that's the sort of, the sort of historical mechanism for the process by which.
But then Stewart, going back to the question that I asked, what was it about London? What were the there were two things that you mentioned in the book, two decisions that were made about visas and about investment, which.
There were two key reasons why the Russian super rich chose to come to London rather than anywhere else. I mean, they did go elsewhere, but the bulk of them came to London. And the first is they liked London. Many of them had put down roots. They sent their children here. They liked the public schools. They liked the legal system. They liked the security of London. They liked the fact that it was halfway between Asia and New York for doing business. So they actually liked it, but the absolutely fundamental key reason why they came to London was because the British state, and by the British state I mean the government, the city, the establishment, the property establishment wanted wealth to come to London. There was this big attempt to get money into London. So the British government, they bent all the rules, they bent the tax rules, they turned a blind eye to the providence of the wealth of the Russians. They were desperate because they thought money coming into London would fuel the London boom, it would be good for London and all the rest of it. And I mean, they even, in 1996, actually it was John Major government and passed this act, inventing something called the investment visa. Under the investment visa, that if you spend £1 million in Britain on government securities, then you're given a fast-tracked immigration status. And that, I've spent the last 18 months, I've sent in about 20 Freedom of Information Acts trying to get to the roots of how many people have been giving an investment visa and by what nationality and how much they've spent. And I've drawn a blank wall of it. But the investment visa, I think, was quite a significant factor in this. So basically, we wanted them here, and they came here, and London became known as the foreign billionaire capital of the world because, unlike New York or Paris or Tokyo, who didn't bend the rules, we bent the rules because we wanted them. When I say we, the British state wanted them here.
I mean, excuse me, I think the other point about it is that the oligarchs and the Russians see London as a haven. London's now like a tax haven, but it's also, I think security was a big issue for them. And they regarded London as a haven from prosecution, haven from paying tax, a haven from any kind of regulatory or criminal investigation. And it's, you know, it's no coincidence that not one Russian oligarch has been extradited back to Russia. And a lot of the Putin and the Kremlin claim there's some sort of conspiracy and corruption, but actually the reality of it is that the main reason they are here is to avoid prosecution for tax and other allegations. And the reason they're not extradited back to Russia is that the judiciary here understand and ruled that if they go back, they're not going to get a fair trial. And so there's actually not a conspiracy in this case, but and so that's a major reason why they like London. And Stuart's right, they like the lifestyle. But I think it's an element of safety, security. They feel safe here from a whole range of reasons, and security is very important for the oligarchs, and I think that's a major reason.
But as far as I understand it from your book, quite apart from those who have actually found refuge here, the ones who come and go, all the Deripaskas and people like that, actually, Putin doesn't seem to mind the fact that this least favoured nation, Britain, is the playground of his very rich.
Yeah, he drives him crazy, actually, quite the opposite. Putin is just absolutely obsessed, certainly with Berezovsky. He's absolutely, drives him incandescent with rage that he can't bring back the oligarchs back, and he cannot understand the British judiciary, which is, for all the faults of British society and establishment, is actually objective and fair, whereas in Russia it's completely politicized, and the courts and the judiciary in Russia it's arbitrary, it's politicized, it's corrupt, and so he cannot understand why he puts in an extradition application, and why they didn't send him back, you know.
Then why don't you think he minds the others, the Deripaskas and the Abramoviches?
Well, because most of them have stayed in Russia. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, there's two groups of Russians, super rich Russians. There's the group that's fallen out with Putin because they wouldn't play by the game. And, you know, we're talking about Kaczynski and Berezovsky and Litvinenko and a series of others, and the UKOS executives, all of whom have landed in London, all of whom have extradition treaties, requests that have been turned down. And they are in exile in London, and he is absolutely, you know, angry, and that's part of the reason for the diplomatic fallout, was the fact that the British state, you know, won't send them back or allow them to go back. But there's another group which are, you know, which have played Putin's game, of which Abramovich is probably, you know, the best example, and Deripaska is another example, who are like international, you know, global rich nomads. They have been given a license to go wherever they like, you know, so they're allowed to come here. But, you know, Putin hasn't tried to stop those. But the reason for that is because they play by the rules. They do exactly what Putin wants. When Putin wanted Abramovich to, you know, become a governor of Siberia, he became a governor of Siberia. When he wanted him to sell Sibneft, he sold Sibneft. When he wanted him to pay more taxes, he paid more taxes. When he wanted him to, you know, finance the Russian football team, he financed the Russian football. So there is this little group of favoured oligarchs who are allowed to move freely. So there is this complete dichotomy. I mean, there's sort of one group which is out of favour and one group that's totally in favour. And these reflect, you know, there's the rebellious group that hate Putin, want to take him on, you know, and then there's this sort of, you know, the Abramovich group that you know, basically want to have it both ways, and have been given this incredible license. And it's interesting because I think Abramovich is in some, well, I mean, you know, Abramovich has bought himself insurance by buying Chelsea. So but he's also seen as something of ambassador. You know, there's sort of, Abramovich is seen as a sort of goody. You know, he's kind of, you know, he bought Chelsea. He's kind of liked by the Chelsea players. He's seen as a sort of, he's seen as corrupt. You know, he's slightly shy. He's not seen as a crook. he is a crook, but he isn't seen as a crook.
Allegedly, yeah.
Anyway, allegedly. So no lawyers here. I assume this is.
It's too late. It's too late. We're screwed.
I mean, but
I'm going to go now. Actually.
Well, Stewart, can I be your feed here? Because there's a wonderful
You said
quote.
it, not me.
There's a wonderful quote which you two have found from Deripaska in July 2007, which is very revealing about his relationship to Putin. If the state says we need to give it up, we'll give it up, he said. I don't separate myself from the state. I have no other interests. Now, how about that? It's an extraordinary thing to say.
Well,
And you say he probably regretted it.
No, I think he's being honest. And it's basically because in Russia, what you have is authoritarian capitalism. It's a form of state capitalism where assets are ostensibly held by very wealthy businessmen, but in fact the state can take those assets back and give them backwards and forwards. And I think there's a certain amount of evidence that even these privately owned, ostensibly privately owned assets, there are the Kremlin, through third parties and joint stock companies, actually hold ownership in those assets. So Deripaska is a custodian of for the state, really. And so I think he was just being very honest, very blunt.
I think that he was under considerable pressure at that particular time, Deripaska, because he was trying to unload his company, Rusal. I mean, he was trying to unload it on the British stock market. I mean, he was trying to do an IPO. I mean, trying to sell parts of it on the British stock market. And he's a highly controversial figure, Deripaska, because of his past, and he was having great difficulties. And I think what happened was that that I think he was under pressure from Putin, and he had to demonstrate in order to be sanctioned to allow to go ahead with this. He had to play this relationship between the oligarchs who stayed in Russia and have to kowtow to Putin in order to survive. This was about demonstrating. I think he was under pressure to say something similar like that, to admit that that if he was forced to sell it back, he would sell it back. He sees, and that is to do with the sort of relationship between Putin and the oligarchs who've been allowed to have their freedom. They every now and again they have to, accept.
And on the larger canvas, I think it's also very revealing about the understanding of the concept of private property in Russia. I think that concept is provisional in not only in a country which was until 20 years ago entirely socialized, but I think the roots of that provisionalness actually go right the way back into history, and so it's not just Putin. This is something
more historic
about Russia,
Yeah, I mean, there's an old Marxist saying, which is property is theft, and I think there's a certain arbitrary. In Russia, property and companies can be interchanged and auctioned in dubious ways, and I think it's almost certainly in the 90s was completely chaotic, and for me the problem in Russia is the rule of law, because contracts can't be enforced. So when the rule of law is so arbitrary, so politicized, so corrupt, and not enforced in any kind of objective way, real competitive capitalism can't exist, because contracts can't be enforced and can't be honoured. And so and then that's when the oligarchs can exploit that situation through political insider influence. And I think that's the essence of the problem there.
Yes, I think that, there's a very dramatic example of that which has come up over the last day or two, which is the terrible death of Sergei Magnitsky, the Russian lawyer who was imprisoned for trying to because he believed, as an idealistic young lawyer, he believed in the law too much, and he tried to, on behalf of the Hermitage Fund, Browder's Hermitage Fund, he tried to hold, he exposed a tax evasion scheme, the biggest that has surfaced in Russia, and paid the price by being imprisoned. And I think it's a very vivid example of quite why so many people have ended up taking refuge in London. You know. Perhaps now we should take advantage of this audience being as rich as it is, and I mean rich. I mean rich in my sense of the word.
Oh, okay.
In information.
Intellectually, you mean?
And get a few questions from them. Yes, can we have a microphone? I think if you bellow, we'll probably hear.
Okay, well I'll bellow then. I just wondered what sort of access you got to the actual oligarchs themselves living here in London, and how much time you spent with them, and what your impressions were of them as people and how they live.
Zero. Niet. Zit. Nothing. I mean, basically, I think we decided that it was pretty clear from their track record that they weren't going to cooperate in this kind of investigation, and there was sufficient. I mean, most of the oligarchs have given interviews, so even though we approached them, it was pretty clear that we were not. It was not that kind of book. It was not a kind of inside the world of the oligarchs in terms of following them around, and so I think we had a lot of good new information. I think we just built on that. I mean, what do you want to say anything on that, Stuart, in terms of our approach?
Well, I think we actually took a deliberate decision quite early on not to interview any of the key oligarchs, partly for legal reasons, but partly because the evidence is that everybody who was interviewed. First of all, they hardly ever give interviews. Abramovich has given interviews and given nothing away. Deripaska has given interviews. He gave an interview to Newsnight, in which a British journalist followed him for 4 days in Moscow. He said absolutely nothing. And the problem was that the kind of revelations that we had in the book, if we'd interviewed them, we would have had to given them these revelations, it would have caused problems. So we took what we did is interviewed a lot of people who knew them, and so we gathered our information from acquaintances, people who'd worked with them, people who knew them, people who had been friends with them. So we gathered the information that way rather than directly. It would have been a very different book. But that was an early decision that we took.
I mean, also Berezovsky's given dozens and dozens of interviews. He loves giving interviews. He'll talk to the Hackney Gazette or the East Dulwich Bugle. He just loves the media, and he's given hundreds of interviews. So we're able to draw on that archive in terms of quoting. He's quoted throughout the book, and whenever any of the oligarchs have been interviewed, we've represented their views. As Stuart said, Deripaska's given maybe 2 interviews in the whole of his career. Abramovich has given maybe 1, 2 at the most. So that was our approach.
You talk about this dichotomous situation with regards to Putin. Has anything changed since Medvedev came into power? Is there a new dichotomy being created?
I think there's been a lot of rhetoric. I mean, he's talked about rooting out corruption and making the judiciary more fair and honest, but I think it's just, as far as I can tell, it's just rhetoric. There's been no actual action. There's been no evidence of any implementation. I mean, I think the case of Hermitage Capital, where here you have a businessman, Bill Browder, who was the largest foreign investor in Russia for many years, had a very good track record. He had no problems with the authorities, and I think maybe just before Medvedev took over, he was suddenly banned from going into Russia. He was stopped at the airport in Moscow, and he had invested hundreds of millions in Russia, and his Hermitage Capital, his investment fund, was effectively closed down. And then the case what you mentioned recently, his lawyer arbitrarily imprisoned and now dead. And I think that's a pretty damaging case against the new regime, and it's hard to see that there's been any real change.
Do you feel concerned about your own personal safety, or does you remain concerned about your own?
Could you say something about how you feel about your own personal safety, either how you have felt or how you currently feel about your safety?
Well, I don't go into any helicopters. If anyone asks me to ride in a helicopter, I'm someone who tastes my tea in advance. No, I'm only joking. No, I think, what can you do if you become so obsessed with security and what's going to happen, and people saying, oh, you're going to get kidnapped and all the rest of it, and there's going to be kind of threats, then you might as well not do the job. I mean, that's my view. I don't know what you think, Stuart.
Well, I think there's always been a sort of underlying issue about, because, I mean, some of these guys are, pretty unpleasant, and I think I think the issue that's been more, worrying is libel, really, and because they're very litigious and they're very rich, and there's this concept called nuisance libel. They'll basically take you on just for the sake of it, even though it costs them £1 million or something. So, I mean, the effect of that has mean we've obviously had to tailor the book to try and avoid that. So, I don't think any of us have felt particularly threatened, other than through libel. It hasn't happened yet.
I mean, a few death threats would help sales, but not.
Yes.
I'm happy to oblige.
Hi, Don Jordan. First of all, I'd just like to say I really enjoyed the book. Really enjoyed the book. Thought it was terrific. And I just want to ask a question about this whole thing about the nature of ownership of these assets. It absolutely fascinates me. And I have to say I'm still completely baffled by it all. This is not a criticism of your book in any way, but it seems to me that if we take a comment earlier on about the provisional nature of ownership, it seemed to me that there's an awful lot of these oligarchs, an awful lot of people in Russia have no confusion about the provisionality of ownership. As long as the money's taken out and the assets are out, then they know what they actually own, and they own estates and yachts and huge amounts of money and all the rest of it. But this provisional nature, it seems to me, at home. And I wonder if you have any ideas, anything you could tell us about the nature of Putin's view about this, because it seems to me there's a confusion at the heart of the current administration about what to do about the oligarchs, what to do about money, what to do about nascent capitalism, and so on. And it seems to me this idea that you were talking about, I think, Mark, you mentioned it, of money could be taken and given away again, talking about Deripaska. This is like the old dacha system, it seems to me, which was started, of course, way back hundreds and hundreds of years ago under the Tsars. And the dacha means gift. You could be given the house or the estate or whatever, but of course it could also be taken away from you. And I wonder whether or not to what extent is this dacha system still really extant? And to what extent do you think, second part of this question, one, is this still a dacha system at home for those who have not left? And two, to what extent is Putin confused about what to do? I mean, he comes in and he finds this very confused situation left over from Yeltsin about the ownership of the major assets of the state. What on earth do you do next? Is he confused by all of this, like the rest of us are, like I am?
In the 1990s, Putin wrote an MA thesis. I think we quoted in the book. I can't remember whether you do or not, but I've got a copy. But in which he said the model for the for Russia was for the commanding heights of the country to be owned by the state, i.e., natural resources or oil, in order to prevent the West getting access to them, to exploiting them, to developing them, and taking profits out of the country. And I think what he's trying to do is implement that. And so what has happened in the last 5 years is there's been this steady attrition of taking, privatized assets, the things that were privatized under Yeltsin, back into power. So, you have Rosneft, took over Sibneft, I mean, some of this has been bought at full market price. Some of it has been seized. So UCOS was seized for nothing. And there has been this steady, attrition back. So, the sort of, so his view of it is a sort of semi-state capitalist sort of model. I mean, in the sense that he, quite a lot of that's gone back into Russian ownership, and some of it's been done compliantly. So, Abramovich handed over Sibneft. And some of it has been, non-compliant, like UCOS, and there's various other examples. Particularly Khodorkovsky, which is obviously, his UCOS was seized. Though you could have argued that it might not have been seized if Khodorkovsky had been more compliant, but effectively, like Abramovich. But I mean, effectively, it was seized back. And there have been several other smaller examples of that. There have been, a steady stream of Russian exile, minor oligarchs where their assets have been seized and they've come to London. There's about 6 or 7 of them. So there's been this steady renationalisation, re-centralisation of the state. And this fits very much with sort of Putin's philosophy, who is a kind of semi-authoritarian when he plays, he believes in some respects in a free market, but he wants the Russian state. He doesn't want the rest of the world to take advantage.
And that was what I meant by confusion. There's obviously something to be played between these two needs of the market and also the renationalisation of assets.
I think he's fully authoritarian, I would say, and it's very politicized, and I think he took on the oligarchs mainly for political reasons. He realized that the oligarchs are very unpopular throughout Russia. All the polls show that they're incredibly unpopular throughout the Russian population, that he would gain political advantage from doing it. But as Stewart says, he's absolutely right in terms of his political philosophy and ideology, in terms of state ownership or state capitalism, in terms of ostensibly being privately owned, but the state has the real power. And so, but I think it's so politicized. I don't think Putin is really confused at all. I think he has a very clear vision of state control.
I probably just add one thing, which is I completely agree with what you're saying, but I would say that there are an awful lot of people among the elite who recognise that this is not what you'd call a growth model, that it doesn't, it's a dead end, it's a cul-de-sac, and that if you are going to build a Russia which can be modernised, can move into information technology, knowledge economy, all these things, then it will have to change models. It'll have to become something different than this thoroughly corrupt, vertical of power. But how to do that is the problem, and that's the problem that Medvedev is visibly wrestling with. How, when you're sitting on the branch, can you cut it off?
Just a very quick question following on from that. Anthony McCall-Judson. I've heard, could you just give us a few words about how the oligarchs got chosen, if you have any knowledge? I've heard from various unreliable sources the fact that they were all deliberately ignorant of all the businesses they went into. They were virtually all Jewish because most Russians don't like Jews, etc. Hence, completely malleable, utterly, totally dependent on their masters. Is that also part of the general picture?
I don't think they were chosen. I don't think they were chosen. I think they were the masters. I think it's the other way around. It's the oligarchs who, certainly in the late 90s, conspired amongst themselves, really, to support Yeltsin, make sure he's re-elected in '96, and the oligarchs chose Putin, to be the successor. And the fact that they're Jewish, I think, is almost irrelevant. I think the real issue is the fact that, it was very politicized. I mean, the word oligarch comes from the classical Greek philosophy of a political elite. Just because you're a wealthy businessman doesn't make you an oligarch. The word is very much focused on political power, political influence peddling to result in huge wealth. And so, I mean, I don't think they were chosen. That's my view.
Where did their money come from in the first place? In the very earliest Yeltsin years.
Well,
nobody actually had any money to start with.
Well, they started, but
they had the money to buy even at the knockdown prices.
Well, I mean, during the Gorbachev perestroika early reforms, which allowed a certain amount of private enterprise, there was this sort of group of entrepreneurs in inverted commas, of which Abramovich and Khodorkovsky and Berezovsky and various others started making money in a small way through that new freedom. So they were doing the hustling, they were trading oil. I mean, Abramovich made money by trading oil. Berezovsky made money by trading cars. So he went into Berlin. He went into Eastern Europe and into Western Europe and bought cars and bought them back and sold them at a premium. And so they started to make modest sums of money. Well, when I say modest, not modest by our standards, but they became millionaires in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and some of them were then given because they were relatively well off. They were given a license to set up banks, and in early 1990 they relaxed the rule whereby that only the state banks could hold the state deposits, and they opened that up. So various private banks, particularly Khodorkovsky's Menatap Bank, was given, for example, he was given the Ministry of Defence deposit and so on, and all that process enriched these people. That they became millionaires. By 92, 93, 94, something like that, they were millionaires. They probably were tens of millions. And then, of course, they made the big killing during the big privatization process in 1995, when Yeltsin, the state was bankrupt and Yeltsin was sick and ill and all the rest of it, and he needed the money, and he did this deal. So they bought the rest of the during the privatization, they bought the rest of. There was only there's only a few people who could buy these within Russia, and although this was meant to be an international auction, they were meant to sell off the state assets. I mean, we're talking the commanding heights of the economy. We're talking about, the oil companies, the metal companies, the telecom companies, that represented something like 40% of Russia's wealth, were all sold off in the matter of a year to 30 oligarchs, to 30 political insiders at a fraction of their value.
One thing that I might add, which is just particularly about the one who was the richest of them all, Khodorkovsky, he actually came out of the bowels of the beast. I mean, out of the Komsomol, the party, the Komsomol being the youth aspect of the Communist Party. And if you want to read a very, very revealing document on this and how he grew out of the establishment, you should look up a correspondence which is on Open Democracy Russia between him from prison and a novelist called Ulitskaya, which is actually about where he came from and how he believed in the model of the Soviet Union right to the end. And I don't think he's joking when he says it. Very strange.
The community, are they a community, the ones who are here in exile? Do they interact with each other? Not at all. Or is it just old business rivalries that keep them apart? They don't see themselves as an exiled community. And the other question is, what is their relationship, if any, with the ones who come and go but have allied themselves with Putin?
Well, the interesting thing about the big oligarchs in London, I mean, the super rich oligarchs in London have all fallen out with each other big time. They used to be colleagues. They used to be friends. They used to holiday together and all the rest of it. They're now almost entirely mutual enemies. to the extent that they are all suing each other in the British High Court. So Abramovich and Berezovsky are suing each other. Deripaska is being sued by Mikhail Cherny. They're all suing each other over the ownership of billions of pounds, because when they acquired all these assets, the big oil companies and all and the metal companies and the aluminium companies and all the rest of it, very little of this was, there was no rule of law in Russia at the time. So basically what happened was that there were gentlemen's agreements, like, okay, we'll buy this together, you put in 50 million, we'll run it like this. There was nothing written down, there was, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, what's happened, and then there were lots of sellouts, and, when Berezovsky came to London in exile, Abramovich bought out his companies. They're all now in the High Courts arguing about who owns that money. We're talking about billions of pounds. I mean, so, Berezovsky is suing Abramovich for like 3 or 4 billion pound. And Mikhail Cherny is suing Deripaska for a similar sort of money. There's dozens of these court cases going on at the moment. The British lawyers are making an absolute killing out of it. But they hate each other. They've all fallen out. And so there is this, there's lots of stuff in the book about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think also they have different agendas. Berezovsky has a very political agenda, and they actually don't intermingle, and they're not a community at all. And actually, one of the main reasons for this sort of obscene spending, that's just way over the top spending, where Abramovich will spend 300 million on another yacht, or 46 grand on a bottle of wine, and 50 grand for a takeaway when he's in Azerbaijan, and all this kind of crazy stuff. It's actually, a lot of it is to showing off. It's a sort of braggadocio kind of, I am the man. I can spend more than you. I have bigger yachts. I have bigger jets. So there's no real community. I think maybe on the sort of more bourgeois or middle class Russian community, or different socioeconomic, there's maybe more of a community in London. But I mean, I think the book is primarily about the oligarchs, and we found that actually there's no real cohesion between them. I mean, they'll have political alliances for the sake of expediency, but not because they get on with each other.
Certainly further down the pecking order, there are wonderful communities of Russians who are having a completely different and very happy existence here with one another, and largely bypassing us.
Really leads me to my question, which is, during your research, did you get a sense of how the average Russian must be feeling about all of this? You've got this kind of super rich with fairly obscene kind of spending, and then you've got the man in the street, the average Russian. Is there a kind of resentment against these people? And secondly, it has been, I suppose I must say, alleged, must use that word, that Putin himself has been greatly enriched by his association with the oligarchs. That's been alleged by some Russian dissidents. Did you get any sense of that?
Well, I mean, on the first question, the ordinary Russian people, on the whole, hate the oligarchs, and that's part of the reason why Putin decided to take on the oligarchs, because he knew that he was on safe political grounds. And they hate the oligarchs because, the oligarchs were seen to, steal a good deal of Russia's wealth and take it out of the country and help to impoverish the country. And there's no doubt that, capital flight in the 1990s was one of the key factors that led, to the collapse, to the sort of 1998, the sort of collapse of the ruble and everything else. So there is this, they do see them as robber barons. I mean, the thing about the American robber barons, they did actually create wealth, whereas the Russian robber barons didn't create any wealth, they just absolutely stole it. So they are, you know, fantastically unpopular. I mean, the interesting thing about Berezovsky is, you know, Berezovsky sees himself as, you know, a future president of Russia and that, but he's more or less universally hated.
But I think also what happened with the oligarchs, not so much they made a huge amount of money, but the fact that what did they do with it? They made a huge amount of money very quickly by basically political politicking. And what did they do with it? They didn't invest it in Russia. They didn't put money into social projects, even though they had huge amounts of wealth. They didn't put it into any charity. They basically moved the money out of Russia, moved it via offshore companies through Cyprus and BVI and a whole complex web of flight capital. And I think that's probably a primary reason, as much as anything else, that the ordinary Russian people, and you have to remember there's still huge poverty in Russia. I mean, I think the latest figures on the mortality rate for ordinary Russians is something like 51 years old. And so I think they see all this wealth, which is all over the newspapers. They see this ridiculous amount of money being spent abroad and not in Russia. And that just festers the hatred even more. And I think Putin is not helped by the fact that he has not invested sufficiently in the infrastructure in Russia itself. And so I think and you probably know more about this than I do, but I think there's a real resentment. Just to answer your second question, there have been allegations about Putin enriching himself as being like an oligarch himself. I mean, who knows? I've never seen any credible evidence. If anyone has any evidence, then, you know, please contact us. But, you know, I think, you know, someone said of Putin that he wants to rule like Stalin and have a lifestyle like Abramovich, and that may or may not be the case. But I think to answer your question, there's never been any real evidence so far of Putin, and my gut is that I think he's more interested in raw, brutal political power than buying lots of yachts.
Well, there is some evidence, and which has come out from Russian sources itself, which to the effect that Putin is actually the richest man in Russia. But, we have lots more questions. So,
I'd like to ask I'd like to ask if the term oligarch can still be used, because really, didn't they really lose all their political power as soon as Putin came into power and he effectively stripped it? Aren't they just mega businessmen?
Well, I think there are different. There's a different kind of oligarch now, in the sense that, as Stuart was saying, Deripaska is an oligarch in the sense that he's a creature of the Kremlin in terms of him holding assets in effect on behalf of the Kremlin. So he's an oligarch in the sense that he's very political and he has to play the political game in the same the connection with the oligarchs of the late 90s was that they made their money by playing the political game in terms of ensuring that Yeltsin did what they wanted. And now there are different kinds of oligarchs in the sense that they are holding on to their wealth, whereas the oligarchs in the late 90s used politics to accumulate their wealth.
Question concerning the oligarchs. Are they, in your view, historical anomalies, in the sense you described them as a product of the Yeltsin privatization period, and the antipathy that ordinary Russians and indeed the state shows toward them? Are there oligarchs in the making who will replace them? Or are these just anomalies of history which will fade from view? I think particularly in view of the fact that you're dealing now with a Russia that's experiencing recession, natural resources are less valuable. Are we going to have a new model of the Russian capitalists from, as opposed to the past oligarch model?
Do you want to take that, Stuart? Or?
Well, I mean, I think the interesting thing, I mean, there have been various phases of the super rich in Russia. There was the pure oligarch phase in the 1990s, where, you know, 20, 30, 40 people who, you know, were political insiders seized a significant proportion of the Russian state on the cheap. But then since 2000, there've been a new generation of rich Russians who are more genuine entrepreneurs. I mean, the thing about the oligarchs, they weren't really entrepreneurs. They weren't entrepreneurs in the sense they created wealth from scratch and created businesses, and they built the the oil refineries and all the rest of it. They just took it, and they're not really entrepreneurs. But there is a second wave of Russians who are more traditional entrepreneurs, i.e., who have created, internet companies and telecom companies and retail companies, who are doing pretty well, and they're now these sort of people are up now in the sort of international rich lists, but they're not oligarchs because they probably don't have the same political power. They're just businessmen. So they're not like the oligarchs. The thing about the oligarchs is that they combined wealth and power, whereas this present generation, they're just straightforward. I mean, they're just like just like the sort of British businessmen, rich British businessmen, created wealth from scratch and have a little bit of influence over politics or the rest of it. They probably get summoned, but they're not. They don't have hotlines to the Kremlin, and not inside the Kremlin. If that's what
I assume these new generation of capitalists are accepted to a greater degree within Russia itself, because if they create wealth, they presumably create jobs and do have a affiliation with Russia. Whereas, as I understand it, the oligarchs we're speaking of here are somewhat isolated from the mainstream of the Russian economy.
Yeah, that's correct. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some cases of, I think that the thing about Russia is there is huge political uncertainty, and so all the Russian rich businessmen are a little bit nervous because they never quite know whether their assets are going to be seized. So there has been this sort of sense, there has been what Russians call a sort of exit strategy, i.e. even some of the more recent genuine entrepreneurs have been floating their companies in London, not to reinvest, but to sort of take a portion of their money. So there has been a certain amount of unloading of their wealth. So, I mean, right, it's not like, the West. It is still, I mean, businessmen can create wealth. And there have been a few examples, I think there have been a few examples of people who have been forced into exile who you could see as sort of post-2000 entrepreneurs rather than pre-2000 oligarchs.
Can I add something? There's an irony here, which is that, one of the characters who I followed over a period of 16 years, who was just a bright young engineer when I met him, trading in chewing gum in 1992. And he's now a manufacturer and a large farmer. And when you talk to him about when was best to operate, he would say the 90s was the time, because that was, yes, it was rough, but then the thing that you were, you had to watch for was just bandits. But the state was not quite the problem that it has become. But that now business is really no fun doing business in Russia, because every morning he wakes up and he doesn't know whether he'll go to work and find that the locks have been changed and the tax authorities, i.e. power, i.e. the vertical of power, will just have taken over. And that's his daily nightmare. And it's not a good climate for ordinary business practice. A couple of people here.
Giving this a bit of historical perspective, has it happened before somewhere else? So let's say 19th century, early 19th century Britain or something. Has something like this happened before?
I'm not in such a crude and such an extreme level. I don't think so. But I mean, the unique nature of what happened in Russia in the 90s was privatization. I think that's the root of how these people made so much money, so little, so quickly. And I think it was, I'm just trying to think of other examples, and I can't really think. I mean, even in Britain in the 1980s, when there was a lot of mass privatization, you did have a group of very wealthy tycoons, Lord Hanson, Lord King, and those people that did become wealthy, but not to this extent. And I think probably the main reason for that was that when it happened in Russia, it was done in such a extreme way that they took assets which were worth billions and billions and only paid, you know, for argument's sake, an asset worth 8 billion, they would get for 100 million, and it was just as crude as that. And as you said, in the 90s, it was complete chaos. It was laissez-faire capitalism at its very worst, the Wild West, where anything goes, no rule of law, and politicians were corrupted, and the judges would just rig auctions, and it was just complete chaos, basically. I can't think of any. I'd be interested. It's quite an interesting question. I can't think of a historical comparison, but I'd be.
I mean, there have been historical parallels where there have been total wealth grabs, i.e., you know, I mean, you know, in Britain, you know, I mean, there's been, you know, the land grabs, the Henry VIII, you know, stealing the Catholic. I mean, there've been in Britain. There've been lots of examples of wealth grabs. That you know, I mean, in Africa, you know, in the 20th century, there are lots of examples of, you know, Russia of African dictators stealing. You know, stealing the wealth created, the historic wealth for themselves. So, I suppose the slight, you know, so they have. I don't know if that's what you meant, but. I mean, in terms of the scale of wealth grab, i.e., you know, a handful of individuals grabbed, you know, a fifth, or whatever the figures are, of a country's wealth in a matter of years for themselves, and then, you know, had complete freedom of what they did with it. There are historical parallels, but I suppose the interesting thing is that most of those are medieval examples, or they're examples in, you know, the corrupt, you know, Africa.
There's a very good description. There's a very good description in their book of the one attempt that was made to distribute wealth was to give every citizen these vouchers. But of course, they were given out at a juncture when ordinary Russian citizens had absolutely no idea what this marketplace was, and they were just given this bit of paper. And so when people there were these, in every tube station and every bus stop, there were people standing there offering to buy your voucher at a point where you didn't know whether you were going to be able to get through the next winter, whether you were going to be able to buy enough potatoes and bread to get through next winter. Somebody was at least offering you a little bit of money for your voucher. And these oligarchs were going around hoovering up all these vouchers. They understood what this bit of paper was worth. But it's well described in the book. Now, you had a question.
Back there, yeah.
Well, anyway, he's forgotten it. In the back, yes.
You alluded to how well connected the oligarchs here are in London politically and obviously to the intelligence community. Do you ever foresee, with the potential change in government in a few months' time, how maybe such wonderful stalwarts of the former Conservative Party, such as Lord Tim Bell, who represent half of our lovely oligarchs here, whether there will be any greater reception for some of the oligarchs here? And do you ever foresee a time when maybe Berezovsky will be offered up on a plate back to Russia? And then quickly, second question, in relation to a lot of talk about the libel laws, some discussion over the last couple of weeks in relation to reform of the libel tourism laws. Would you have been able to write a more worrisome book for your publishers if those changes had been in place?
Well, I think on the first question, they're already welcomed here. They're already accepted. They have very few problems being here. You know, they've not been extradited back to Russia. I don't think Cameron becoming Prime Minister is going to actually change that much. I think it's actually to do with the law as much as politics. I mean, Putin thinks that Berezovsky has bribed various cabinet ministers and the Home Secretary and officials to stay in, but actually it's about the judiciary, and it basically comes down to a judge in Bow Street Magistrates Court who's thrown out all these extradition requests because there's evidence that if these oligarchs and businessmen are sent back to Russia, they're going to be either assassinated, kidnapped, thrown in jail for political reasons, and that's the crutch of it. So I don't think Cameron I don't think anything will change with that. And on the second question, absolutely yes. I mean, I think if they change the law of libel and also the law on breach of confidence and privacy, whereby if you obtain a document through legitimate means and it reveals something secret or new, suddenly and the other side think that you've got it. Suddenly it's a tsunami of letters and emails from lawyers. So I think that absolutely would have been a tougher book in those circumstances.
Thank you. With your reference to oligarchs, very rich oligarchs and minor oligarchs, and the title of Londongrad, from Russia with cash, is there any space for the other very large Russian community that lives in London as well, and they can be part of the ordinary Russians who bring culture and lots of other goodness to UK? Because I think the conversation has been biased in that way.
I think that's what the book's about.
The book doesn't say just because these people are Russian and wealthy that they're bad people. The book is about wealth and power. It's just because they're Russians. But I mean, as you say, probably 99% of Russians living in London are hardworking, decent, and honest people. It's not about. It's not an anti-Russian book, and in the same way we could easily write a book about American capitalists at the moment, or the banks, for example, who basically have enriched themselves on the basis of being bailed out by the taxpayer, and then the banks completely caused this economic crisis, and what happens? They get bailed out by the taxpayer. Our money goes in, and then they use our money to give themselves bonuses. So, in a sense, that's a different kind of. It's not. In a sense, it's all. You could argue that a lot of certain bankers in this country and in America are forms of oligarchs because they were bailed out by the government. They used a lot of political influence peddling to enrich themselves. So, there are plenty of British oligarchs and American oligarchs.
I would add to what Mark said that of course it was we who in 1992, I mean we meaning the Americans and the international institutions who laid down the rules of the game at a moment of the high point of the liberal marketplace. We laid down iniquitous rules of the game, which made this the result. So I don't think it's quite fair to talk about them as this is not biased against Russians. This is the consequences of what happens when you release the freest of free markets on such unprepared people. Gentleman at the back there, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. In fact, I reviewed your first book, The Press and Political Dissent, many years ago.
God, must be an old man.
Yeah, sure, 1986 or 87. And I'd be pleased to buy a copy of your new book with, Stewart Lansley, it's your co-author. But I'd be very interested to know about exactly how this massive rip-off came about, and I think your explanations from the, from the platform are really inadequate, However, it's not a criticism of your book, which I have not read. But on the other hand, I think another book has to be written about this. You did mention about how that the oligarchs themselves are not to be interviewed, for reasons of libel laws or whatever, But I think a debt is owed to the Russian people, as to just exactly how
all this wealth was taken away from them. Can you just give a general explanation or something about that?
Well, I think we probably have in the sense that, you know, in the 90s, Russia was blessed with incredibly wealthy natural resources in terms of oil, gas, aluminium, and I think partly the oligarchs took advantage of the situation when they were sold off, but also Yeltsin was particularly vulnerable to that. You know, he was someone who certainly towards the end of his regime just was hopelessly drunk part of the time. He was very vulnerable to being manipulated, and that's basically what they did. And so, you know, it's, I mean, I think the other aspect to this, which I find pretty amazing, is the way, not so much, I mean, that story of how they made the money has been told. This book is really not so much how they made the money, but what happened after that in terms of how they moved all this wealth out of Russia and then how they spent it, which is pretty much what the book is about. And I think also the other issues here, which we've not touched on, is about corporate governance in the sense of accountability and in the way that they have moved their money, hidden their money, spent their money. It's incredibly opaque, complicated way, using offshore companies which are owned by offshore trusts, which are then put in the name of a fiduciary, which is the name of something else, which is so many barriers, so that basically protect, to hide this money. And that's part of the reason for some of the oligarchs' decline, is that, you know, basically they, the way they move their money out. But I think also there are sort of broader lessons in terms of the global economic crisis, where you could argue that the crisis was born out of insufficient regulation, bankers who are unaccountable and really, you know, invested and speculated with our money, and in a way that was part of a general corporate culture that has been occurring for the last 15, 20 years. And that, I think there's a connection there, I would argue, between that and what happened with the oligarchs.
But I mean, would you say that, you know, that the connection was, would you say the connection was rather more, you know, a difference between the rule of law and a criminal culture?
Well, yeah, there was no rule of law. That was the problem. I mean, although the oligarchs will claim that actually they didn't break any laws, Yeltsin would just introduce a new law and then they would do it that way. So, you know,
is that not why they came to London?
There was no rule. If you imagine that it is a historically unique moment when communism falls, and there is absolutely nothing in the way of social infrastructure, because the Communist Party ran, all the institutions. Then Yeltsin made the Communist Party illegal, and there wasn't. It was a void, and all this privatization, it all happened in a void of law, a void of institutions, and this was the result.
I'm Russian, and so I think it's fair to have a question from a Russian person. I just wanted to ask if you think your book is biased or balanced, because to me it seems that it is biased, because you mentioned that there are two groups of Russian oligarchs. One is pro-Putin and another one is against. And you said you quote Berezovsky throughout your book, which is obviously hugely anti-Putin. So I think I know what to expect when I'm going to read your book. So what's your idea of that?
So what was that? You think, is it biased?
Is it biased or balanced? Because to me it seems that it's hugely. I just know what to expect, I think, when I will be reading your book, because like in your conversation as well, you were saying, oh, Putin, everyone in Russia hates oligarchs, and that's why Putin is exploiting it. Why don't you assume for a moment that maybe he actually wanted to do something good for the country, and maybe the country actually changed to the better? That's my view as a Russian person, observing the changes and things like that. So.
Well, I suppose my answer to that is I think that the evidence is pretty clear. I don't think...
The evidence of what?
The evidence that, on the whole, the seizure of a significant proportion of the Russian wealth, historic wealth, by a small group of people who then took the money, a lot of the money out of the country, was largely detrimental to the Russian state, to the Russian people. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt, you know, the privatization process led to a mass exodus of money. You know, capital flight in you know 95, 96, 97, 98 was a major problem for Russia. I mean, it reduced the tax take, it increased the government deficit, it meant that the potential money for investment collapsed, it destabilized the foreign exchanges and the financial sector, and it contributed hugely to the 1998 financial crisis. You're saying, I mean, there is an argument. I mean, the oligarchs themselves defend themselves by saying that what we did is that we created a privatized economy. And without us, it wouldn't have happened. Look, you know, there is a counter-argument. We do go into the counter-argument in the book. You know, there's two arguments about the privatization process. One is that there's this group of people who seized it for their own ends and, you know, stole Russia's wealth, spent it abroad, you know, enriched themselves and impoverished Russia. There's another argument which has said, well, you know, the Russian state needed private capitalists to seize, you know, these incompetent, corrupt, you know, companies, to turn them into capitalist companies and make them work internationally. And that's what the oligarchs would say, that's what they did. The oligarchs say, well, you know,
Yeah, but what side do you take in your book? I mean, do you try to be balanced? Or?
Well, no, I mean, it's massively biased. But it's basically biased towards what the evidence leads us towards, which is the truth of what Stewart has just said. And I think the whole myth, certainly when you're writing a book, to think that you can arrive at a sort of scientific version of objectivity is just, for me, ridiculous. And you write a subject about, you know, you researched and you're on a journey, and where your research leads you.
Objectivity is ridiculous. That's quite a ridiculous thing to say, I think.
Well,
sorry, what's ridiculous?
Well, you're saying that objectivity is ridiculous. I mean, if you're trying to write a book about Russian oligarchs and you're just obviously saying that you're taking sides, then kind of...
Well, I didn't say we're taking sides. I mean, we set out to write a book about the oligarchs and the whole Londongrad phenomena, and the research leads you, and you don't don't come to a conclusion that is some kind of centrist middle of the road. You come to a conclusion of what you think has actually happened. And the main reason I would say that the oligarchs are undeniably unpopular in Russia, to whatever extent you want to calculate that, is that they didn't reinvest their wealth in Russia itself. They took all the money out, they hid it, and they spent it on themselves. And I think you'd have a stronger case if people like Berezovsky and a lot of the oligarchs had reinvested in Russia, and I think that's where that argument falls down.
Well, thank you for a wonderful talk. And this way, once we accept the fact that the initial distribution of assets was unfair, shouldn't we acknowledge also the fact that some of the oligarchs you mentioned are talented managers, which in fact, so again, you're overemphasizing the fact that they're unpopular in Russia, but actually, I'm sure if you do a poll in Chukotka, then Abramovich, you know, is going to be very popular in that area. And if you do, you know, again, you know, polls in some cities where, you know, major factories are situated, like in Norilsk, for example, that the oligarchs which own those assets, like Deripaska, again, they are going to be quite popular in those areas. And in fact, you know, the factories, I mean, what they did with the assets we obtained unfairly was quite spectacular, and the companies grew into, you know, one of the largest corporations in the world, and, you know, and in fact a lot of employment and a lot of value added was created in the last 15 years. So again, so basically, you know, the way you picture the whole sort of story is slightly biased, but I accept that in some areas overall, I mean they it could be true that they're unpopular in Russia, but actually in those places they do their business. I mean they tend to be more popular.
Well, I think there's a time issue here, because I think that what happened from about 1999. I mean after the crash in 1998. And when the oligarchs realised they were exceedingly unpopular internationally, what they did is they did try to, particularly Khodorkovsky. I mean, Khodorkovsky tried to reinvent himself as a Western capitalist, and he did try to introduce, kind of better governance, and he started publishing accounts and all the rest of it. So there was, I think there, in the 90s. The oligarchs effectively stripped the assets of the companies they bought, and a lot of that money went abroad. Then they began to realise that if they were going to enrich themselves even more, they had to they had to play by international Western rules. So a lot of them did reinvent themselves as Western capitalists. Khodorkovsky, Deripaska, had incredibly dubious history. He was refused a visa in the United States and all the rest of it. So they did reinvent themselves, and I think there is a sort of historical switch by the early 2000s, the early noughties, that they did start hiring. They did start trying to put their houses in order, and try to, and clearly these companies have been very, very, to some extent very successful. But how far they've been successful as a result of better business management, better entrepreneurialism, how much they've been better simply because of the massive increase in commodity prices, oil prices, and all the rest of it is slightly debatable. But I think there is this change. They suddenly did try to reinvent themselves as honest capitalists to some degree. So if that's...
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else who hasn't? At the back there.
Do you get the sense that they are actually just a sort of transition from one system to another, or do you feel that, that in some form or another they're sort of intrinsic to Russian business life, perhaps going back along many decades, perhaps even centuries, and that they're probably going to be around forever in some form or another?
No, I think that's right. I think they are, in a sense, a historical phenomena. Certainly, people like Berezovsky, who has almost given up on any kind of commercial life. I mean, he exists in London really to try and destabilize Putin in any way he can. And he's almost like a political exile. And I think, on his own admission, on his own public statements, he wants to overthrow Putin and stage a coup. And maybe he should ask Simon Mann to help him out now that he's out of jail, and Mark Thatcher and friends of mine who I'm sure would be interested in embarking on such a crazy. But I think that's right in terms of the transition. I think it's now a new world, and those people are living in the past. And I think certainly Berezovsky's living there. But Deripaska is in such financial trouble that he has to play that political game. But as you say, it happened, and now we're living with the consequences of that. Ordinary Russian people, with so much poverty, are living with the consequences of that, and that's as much Putin's fault as it is the oligarchs.
But I think there is a part. I think the thing is, there is a chapter change. There are the oligarchs who became super rich by seizing historic wealth, and there is a new group of more traditional entrepreneurs who are making money in more traditional ways by creating businesses, by creating retail businesses who, have more genuine, West, if you, there's a Western style business ethics and all the rest of it. So I think the new generation of oligarch. The thing is, we know. Russia is still a very corrupt society. Britain in many ways a very corrupt society. But so clearly. But I think there is. I think there is a big distinction. There are, what happened in the 90s is not being repeated. Russia is moving itself towards a more traditional And it's very successful. I mean, you know, that some of these new, and if you look at if you look at the Sunday Times rich list, or the Forbes rich list, you know, a lot of those Russians are up the top now, not oligarchs. I mean, not 1990s oligarchs, they're noughties oligarchs. I mean, they're not oligarchs in the sense that they seized power and wealth. They're people who created wealth from scratch. So there is a more traditional form of, you know, wealth creation and entrepreneurship going on now.
And your sense is that the sort of political elite is happy with that. It's not. It doesn't sort of feel the need to have this group of business people around it to sort of sustain it and so on. You feel that there's a shift in the Kremlin as much as there is a shift in the business arena.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've got that elite around them, in terms of certainly people like Deripaska and others, but I don't think, you know, what happened in the 90s was actually about privatization. You can't re-privatize state assets, so I think that period is gone, and I think now the political, Putin and the political elite are managing the economy, and in a very interventionist way, obviously. And so I think those old-style oligarchs that we write about in the book are to some extent historic relics, but they are still influential in terms of the whole power struggle.
Gentleman here.
Just a double question. How many of these people actually are there? And secondly, bearing in mind that they brought all this money with them, what influence do they currently have within the city at the moment, and possibly in relation to other wealth migrants, immigrants?
Do you want to take that, Stuart?
Well, I mean, sorry, would you repeat the question, the gentleman saying?
Two-part question. First question is, how many people actually are there in London, oligarchs? How many of them are there?
Okay, well, in terms of the numbers of oligarchs, I mean, the numbers of the super rich Russians.
Yeah.
Well, there are two sorts of Russians. There are those who are living here permanently, who are a mix of people who've chosen to come here and exiles, and we're probably talking about 30, 40, 50 people. We're talking about Berezovsky, we're talking about the UKOS executives who fled after Khodorkovsky was arrested. There've been a sort of steady flow of Russian billionaires coming to London, you know, over the last 2 or 3 years. We name them in the book. There's probably about 30 or 40. Then there's another group of sort of sub-oligarchs, if you like, who are, you know, not billionaires, but they're probably worth, you know, 600 million. You know, there's probably there's quite a lot of them who've got roots in London. They've got businesses here. They've got property empires here. And then there's a group of what we call nomadic Russians who, of which Abramovich is probably one, Deripaska is one, who have have little property empires in London. They own football clubs, or they own newspapers, or and they're footloose. So they live a little bit of time here. They live a little bit of time in Moscow. They have business interests here, etc. So they float around. I mean, this is sort of a modern phenomenon. There's a nomadic super rich. There's lots of them, and there's Indians and kind of Japanese and all the and Mexicans and Nigerians. I mean, this group of these, but the Russian. So there's these three categories. But they spend a lot of the money is come into London. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about which we didn't really write about that much in the book, but is the effect on London has been this wall of money that's moved in the space of a few years. I mean, between about 2001 and about 2006, that moved from Russia to London. Has had a pretty dramatic effect on London.
Well, that was my next question. What effect has their money had within the city in terms of their...
Well, absolutely dramatic. I mean, on the upside, they've created jobs, they helped fuel the boom, money went into property and art, and they created jobs in butler agencies and chauffeurs, in estate agents, in property. You know, a number of Brits became millionaires off the back of it, like the Candy brothers. You know, the Knight Frank, one of the big estate agent in the oligarch belt. You know, were paying city-style bonuses in 2006 and 2007. So they had a very big impact. But you know, that impact. A lot of them, what happened is the money acted like an economic shock. I.e., what I mean by that is this huge amount. If you throw a huge amount of money at a city economy, a lot of which came through the black market. And a lot of it came as money and laundered money, so it came in through the black market. But what happened was that a lot of this money created a massive increase in asset prices. Like, you know, there was a grey markets. We write about this in the book, but you know, these grey markets that were created in 2005 and 2006. So what was happening was that people who were trying to buy Gulfstream jets, there was a waiting list for 3 years. So people would pay, the Russians would pay £5 million to buy a £25 million extra £5 million to jump the queue, and the same with Aston Martin. So this grey market occurred. So what was happening, and I think, you know, the Russians undoubtedly contributed towards the credit crunch by by fueling these rise in these asset prices, which was, you know, the cause of the credit crunch, but also because what was happening is that the British banks were financing the Russians in their international global expansion. I mean, Deripaska borrowed huge amounts of money. They didn't. I mean, the interesting thing about the oligarchs, although they're fantastically rich, they borrowed money. They were leveraging, because leveraging is the way that all these people are making massive money. They were borrowing money. So Deripaska, the reason Deripaska has been one of the people who's lost so much money. I mean, lots of them have lost money in the last couple of years, or they're beginning to rebuild it at the moment because oil prices have risen and all the rest of it. But the British banks lent Deripaska, when he started buying German car companies and Canadian car companies and all the rest of it, he borrowed the money to expand his empire, and he borrowed the money out of British banks. So what happened is when, you know, the share price of all these companies collapsed, you know, and I think it's very difficult to get the figures on this, but I think he's being bailed out by Putin. I think what happened is that Putin,
as a matter of fact, yeah.
Well, Putin has paid off these bank debts because the state, you know, the sovereign funds that Russia had accumulated in the good times have been used to bail out the oligarchs.
That was a very balanced answer, by the way, our friend.
I'll take two more questions, and then I think that we should perhaps break up and just
would you comment, and it's a difficult, I'm sorry, I apologize for the sort of difficulty of asking you this, but comment about the ramifications of the Russian presence in London on intelligence in London now. Because I understand there's about something like 5 times more stringers, whatever you want to say, for Russian intelligence because of the enhanced presence here of Russians in London. And given this incredible tension that exists between oligarchs and the state, and you know, whether it's Deripaska and Abramovich versus Berezovsky et al. And I don't know, again, I apologize.
Well, I mean, the new owner of the London Evening Standard is former KGB man, so that's a little obvious example of that. But that's a historical thing. But that's just a cheap shot on my part. But I think the question is what they're doing here. As you say, there's been a big increase in Russian intelligence agents and officers in London in recent years. Figures show that. And the obvious answer is, given that the Cold War no longer exists, what are they doing here? And it could be that they are here for commercial reasons as much as anything else. And so I think, and then you had the Litvinenko murder, and so that obviously raised the stakes, but then it obviously has diplomatic ramifications in terms of diplomatic relationship between Britain and Russia. But I think the honest answer is we don't really know. What we know is that there's been a huge increase in the number of Russian spies operating in London, and so that obviously has real cause for concern, particularly if they get involved in the commercial sphere, which is dominated by feuds and rifts, and which is how Litvenko stories. That's another story, but I think that's an example of that.
I think you have to bear in mind that London has a long history of welcoming people. I mean, Marx and the great revolutionaries. We have always been a hotbed of other people's trouble, other people's money. We mix it here. One more question. Just you're the last.
I don't know if you wrote in your book about Alexander Lebedev that you just mentioned, who bought the Evening Standard. What's your view about him? He bought a business that is losing money. So, what do you think he's trying to do? Is he trying to get some kind of influence in this country?
Well, I'm not sure that he was actually an oligarch in the sense of his. We do write about Lebedev in the book, but only in the sense of the context of him buying the Standard and the obvious relevance there. But I don't think he did make most of his money in the late 90s. I haven't seen any evidence of him having a particularly insidious relationship with Yeltsin. I mean, why he's bought the Evening Standard, it's certainly not for financial or commercial reasons. Conspiracy theories claim that he's a stooge of Putin, but then I don't think that's correct either. I think he's just someone who has moved here. He likes being in London. He obviously, owning the Standard gives him an entree into the political and social world of London and the United Kingdom. I think it's basically he realizes that it gives him influence for his own political and social reasons. I don't think there's anything sinister about it, and it'd be interesting to see how long he can keep the Standard going.
And I think you have to bear in mind that this is a man who runs a spectacularly good newspaper, who finances it in Russia. I mean, the really ace Novaya Gazeta is the tops. It's really.
It's an anti-Putin.
As an oppositional, it's an opposition in itself. I think we should break up, but I'm sure that Mark and Stuart will be around to be pestered with more questions and hold their end up. Thank you both very much. This is it really was. It's a splendid book to have written, and I think that it's been a little unfair to talk about bias with this book, because it has simply charted one small and extraordinary development, which is the way this money and these people hit London. And so it's not really a book of political analysis. It's a really it's what journalists do, which is actually do all that deviling, get all the facts in one place, and you'll have a good read. Thank you. Bye.